Hi folks. Today in this video we are going to be looking at Photoshop and how to set its preferences to optimize the behavior of Photoshop, because way too often there would be occasions when you would be doing something and everything takes way too long because Photoshop, when you install it, does things on its own in a certain way, which is the default behavior, nothing wrong with it. So we wish to customize it to the way that we want Photoshop to behave. So to start off, if you're on a Mac platform, you go to Photoshop at the top left where it says Photoshop CC, and then click on Preferences and then choose General. Notice there's also a shortcut which is Command K. On a Windows platform, if you're using Photoshop, you perhaps will find this under the Edit menu. Okay? And once you have this Preferences dialog box open up, it will be exactly the same as you see over here on the Mac. So the first thing is the general preferences. So color picker will be Adobe. HUD color picker, which is heads-up display. This is something that becomes available to you through shortcuts while you're working on an image. So you can have a medium-sized or a large size or a small size, or you can have a strip or whatever that you want. I kind of like the medium view, so I will leave that alone. Image interpolation by Cubic Automatic. If you click in there, the drop down, you then see other options and you can choose whatever that you may wish to, depending on what you may be doing. I kind of like to leave it alone to the bicubic automatic. Auto update open documents. This is relevant if you're working on multiple documents and they're linked documents somewhere in there, or perhaps smart objects and you're working on the actual working layered file. So if they're open simultaneously, it'll by default auto update any other document that may be open. In this case, we're not working on multiple documents simultaneously, which may be linked or which may be smart objects, so you can leave it alone. Show start Workspace when no documents are open. Absolutely leave it checked. Nothing will hurt. This doesn't hurt at all. Use legacy new document interface. Legacy literally implies that there was a different interface in the earlier iterations of Photoshop. So do you want that interface? If you're very used to it, you can check and then it'll show. Skip transform when placing. No, leave it unchecked for now. Beep when done. Unnecessary. Export clipboard. No, because exporting clipboard is primarily when you're copying and pasting multiple documents, perhaps within Photoshop or beyond Photoshop into other applications, maybe in Illustrator or InDesign or whatever it may be. So you don't need to check export. Resize image during place. So let's say you're working on a smaller size document in terms of its dimensions and you're copying from a document which is larger. So basically if you check this, it'll resize to fit it in there. That's about it. So you don't necessarily wish to do it because you may not want the entire document. You may just want a piece of it, or you may wish to resize it accordingly. So leave it unchecked. Next up, always create smart objects when placing. I kind of like this because if I'm placing additional files into one file and building a composite of something, I like this because then it allows me to double click in the layers on the smart object and go back and edit if I need to, or if I need to do whatever adjustments that I may need to. So again, I kind of like this to be here. You can uncheck it if you don't propose or plan on working on multiple documents or with smart objects. That's a choice that you make. When you come to the interface aspect of the preferences, then this is more about how Photoshop looks in terms of standard screen mode. What's the default? You can have a black, gray. It's again up to you. You can choose, but basically this allows you to determine and define the way Photoshop may appear on your screen. And again, full screen with menus, default, black, gray, what color you want. So if you're going into a full screen where you're still seeing some of the menus, or a full screen without any menus, you want to preview against neutral colors, you can have it black, gray, default, whatever that may work. I kind of like the black, so I'm setting it to black. Artboards are literally nothing but new pages. So now Photoshop does have the ability to allow you to create multiple pages. And what color do you want the starting artboard to be? Dark gray, default, medium, or a custom color? That's a choice that you make. In terms of the border, notice I have switched everything off because generally it is the drop shadow which may be here in the standard screen mode, because these are just embellishments, and these embellishments do end up taking a fair amount of memory from your system. So you want to make Photoshop work efficiently. So it's a good idea to turn any of these redundant things off. In terms of the user interface language, obviously it is English. For those of you who may be installing it in some other languages, you may have an option of choosing other languages, but I only have installed the English version. User interface font size. So user interface font size is all of these things. It may be visually a bit challenging to read small typeface, so you can actually put it to large from medium or whatever it may be. So again, these are choices that you make. Then you come down to the options. Show channels and colors, dynamic color sliders, and show menu colors. Again, more resources and taking away efficiencies, so I would rather uncheck most of them. Next up, Workspace. Auto collapse iconic panels. So iconic panels are these kind of icons. So do you want them to auto collapse or not? It's up to you, because we'll later on be customizing the workspace, so we may be limiting to the number of panels that may be visible. Auto show hidden panels. So if there are any panels that are hidden behind, so let's say layers, channels, paths, so you do want to be able to see them as to what is out there. So leave it checked. Open documents as tabs. So Photoshop for some time now has developed the capability of actually tabbing the documents if you have multiple documents open at a time, with their names being visible, so you can have them tabbed out there. So this is what it refers to. Enable floating document window docking. If you're not working with tabs and you may have separated a file from the tab, it would basically be floating. So this primarily says, hey, I can still, dock that one particular window within the framework of my workspace. And I like to have large tabs because it's much easier to see. Enable narrow options bar. So the option bar is at the top. So yeah, because I don't want to take too much space, so I've enabled a narrow options bar. Next up is tools. If you're new to Photoshop, it's not a bad idea to have the show tooltips available. Otherwise, you can check it off. And notice rich tooltips disappear as soon as I uncheck this. So rich tooltips are primarily, again, going to be taking up resources because they show you whatever the tool is with a little picturesque drawing explaining what the tool can do for you. So if you're very new to it, it's not a bad idea to have both of these checked. But once you're reasonably familiar with what the tools are, you should check off, because again, it takes more resources. Enable gestures. I don't care about gestures. Use shift key for tool switch. Absolutely yes, because notice in the toolbar, if there's any tool with a little triangular arrow pointing at an angle, it implies that there are additional tools within that tool. So if once you become familiar with the keyboard, which makes life a lot more efficient working in Photoshop, you can use the shift key along with whatever the shortcut key may be for that particular tool to cycle through the variables that may additionally be available. Enable flick panning. This is again a choice. It's literally a gesture where it can behave like, you may be panning through an image when it's in enlarged mode on your mobile device. So this is what it's about. So do you want it to be available? It's up to you. I generally don't want it to be there. Legacy healing, why? Because current technology is superior to the older technology, so it stays unchecked. This is kind of important and relevant. Double-clicking the layer mask launches select and mask workspace. Yes, I would recommend leaving it checked. Vary round brush hardness based on heads-up display vertical movement, not necessarily, because I know my keyboard shortcuts, and it's a much more efficient way to do that, because every time that I enable any of these features, it implies that Photoshop will take up more resources from my system. Next, snap vector tools and transform to pixel grid. Do we need this? Not at this stage, so I would leave this unchecked. Zoom with scroll wheel, why not? Animated zoom, there is no need for it. Zoom resizes window, yes, I would recommend leaving it alone. That may be when you have a separated window docked or undocked. That's where it can perhaps add some value. Zoom click point to center, ignore this for the time being. History log. History is another thing that takes a fair amount of resources. So this is an option if you wish to create a referential document in a Word format or as metadata. So you can check history log and notice then metadata text file of both becomes available. Number one. Number two, session only or concise or detailed. So do you really wish to create a separate text document with every Photoshop file? Not particularly. So in terms of the history log, do you want it to be recorded as a metadata? Sure, why not? Because it'll just take slightly, very, very slightly longer when you're saving the file. But you don't have to do this, okay? So that's one thing. File handling. Image previews. Now, the default may be always save or ask when saving. So, because what it's really doing is it's creating previews of your folder images wherever you may be saving as an icon for you to be able to easily view the image. Do you really need that? Because again, it takes up more time and resources in saving. So I personally prefer never save. Save as to original folder, yes. When you may be creating multiple iterations of a particular file. So the default is that it should be directed towards the source folder from where you had originally accessed the file. Save in background, sure, because this allows you to continue working on a document while another document that you may be saving continues to save itself. A pen file extension, absolutely yes. Lowercase, it's up to you. It doesn't matter nowadays. Automatically save recovery information if you wish to, because if your machine crashes while you're working, so if you have had an opportunity to be working on a file for 10-15 minutes and haven't saved the document, then perhaps you'll be able to recover the past 10 minutes work or whatever that you may have done in the last 10 minutes to the file. But as a matter of habit, when you have done some commands and committed certain work to your image file, it's a good idea to keep saving it periodically. Camera raw preferences, I will talk completely separately, okay? But just one thing over here. Prefer Adobe Camera Raw for supported files. This is something if you were using additional raw processors. This is where you can choose not to check it and then perhaps associate it with some other raw processor if you're accessing your files from Bridge or wherever it may be. So I don't mind having this as the camera raw for supported raw files. Use Adobe Camera Raw to convert documents from 32-bit to 16 or 8-bit. Why not? Because this gives you better controls and you can do final adjustments and tweaks. Leave the ignore EXIF profile tag unchecked. Ignore rotation metadata. Why should we ignore it? Because if you have rotated an image while viewing through Bridge or through Lightroom or whatever it may be, might as well have it appear as a rotated image. Ask before saving layered TIFF file, because TIFF is another file format which has the ability to maintain multiple layers. So if you may be working with a TIFF format, you can tell it whether, Photoshop should be asking you whether to save it as a layered file or a flattened file. Disable compression of PSD and PSB. Drive spaces are not at a premium anymore. They're probably one of the cheapest components, so there's really no need to check this. Maximize PSD and PSB file compatibility always, for multiple reasons, because there may come a point in your life where you may be working with different iterations of Photoshop, or you may be sharing a Photoshop file with some friend who doesn't have the same version as you. So if you maximize the compatibility, then there will be no issues in crossing over to an older version or a newer version. So it's not a bad idea. So make sure it's set to always, because you can always say never or ask. So I kind of like it as always. Recent file list contains. It's up to you. What this is when you open up Photoshop, it'll show you the last few files that you may have been working on. So how many files do you wish to retain in its memory? It's entirely your call. Maybe whatever the number, or let's say you can say 10 or 5 or 1, or whatever it may be. Okay, so make a choice based on your own preference. Export. I would rather talk about this at a later point in time, but leave it alone the way it is as the default for the time being. Performance is perhaps one of the more important aspects here in the preferences. Notice one thing. There's a description panel at the bottom. If you keep your cursor on one of those spaces, it actually gives you a fairly detailed bit of explanation as to what it is talking about. Okay. So available RAM, try and allocate as much RAM as you can without making your life miserable by assigning so much RAM that the rest of the computer or the operating system ceases to function correctly. So test it out, see what you can do and how much you can allocate here before you make a decision. So obviously the higher the RAM allocated to Photoshop, the better, the smoother the performance. Graphic processor settings. So notice as I keep my cursor here, it says use graphic processor activates certain features and interface enhancements. It does not enable OpenGL and already open documents. Okay, features, rotate view tool, bird's eye view, pixel grid, flick panning, and all those wonderful things. Sure, if you have a decent graphics card, it would have a decent graphics processor, do check it. You could go into advanced settings and see what this is all about, but before you go moving these things or choosing what you do, see if that really makes a difference in your life. Okay. In terms of the history and cache, the bigger the history state number, the more the capability that you will have to revert to that point in time. So you can click in here and let's say what's the maximum number, 1,000 undos. But if you put it to this number, that means that you will have the capability of going back to that image while you're working on it, even after you may have committed 1,000 clicks or 1,000 actions on whatever you may have done to the image. Now, but your Photoshop will perform fairly slowly at this point in time. I kind of like around the 15-20 mark, So I'm going to say, okay, let's keep it to 20. And 20 is enough, okay? The fewer the history states, the lower the cache level, the smaller the cache tile size, the better the efficiency within Photoshop. So the default is 50 and the cache level may be 5 or 3, I don't know, and the cache tile size may be larger than 128K. So I have reduced my history states and my cache levels and kept my cache tile size to 128K. Scratch disk is about while you're working in Photoshop with an image, you commit many different commands here and there. So most of the stuff is being retained in what is known as a scratch disk. If you have a slow drive, Photoshop will perform slower because it's also storing information up there. Or if you're using the startup disk as your scratch drive, your system may slow down. I don't know. But these are things that you need to consider. Generally speaking, I kind of prefer not to have my boot drive as a scratch drive, but other drives that may be internal or external, if available, that I would rather use as a scratch disk. So I would like to use the other drives as a scratch disk. So I see, okay, I've got 159 gigs available. So I'm going to put this as the primary number one scratch disk. In case if it fills up, then I'll go to the next and the next. So I'm going to select it and then click on the upward arrow to move it as the primary one. So number one. And I'll take my primary boot drive as the last option. Okay. So now I've got number one, which is the data RAID set, which is a RAID capable, so it's fairly efficient. Next one is another high-speed drive, so this has some space available, and then eventually my solid-state drive, which is also my system drive. So this is important. If you have an external drive or an additional drive, I recommend that you associate that as the primary scratch disk. Cursors, leave it to the default. You can experiment, explore, and see what you prefer, but not a whole lot of difference. So I like to leave it just alone. Transparency and gamut. I don't fool around with the transparency settings. This is primarily a preview of if you're creating a transparent file, how the background would appear. So it's purely visual thing, and you can modify the colors any which way that you want. Gamut warning, the default is a gray. I like the gamut warning to be in a color which is very distinctly visible in case there are colors that may have fallen out of gamut. So clicking on it, it opens up the color picker and you can choose a color. So I have chosen a very bright, rich fluorescent green here. Okay, and I hit OK. So this is here. Next up, units and rulers. What is the unit of measurement that you prefer to work with? Okay, and this is about the rulers that appear at the top and the left. So whichever unit of measurement that you are comfortable with, choose that. I am happy with inches. With type, well, we're not really doing type, but generally speaking, points is what is used in the industry for typefaces. Again, column size and gutter, we are not interested in. New document preset resolution, leave it to 300 pixels per inch and a screen resolution to 72 pixels per inch. That's fine. And leave the point/pica size to PostScript 72 points per inch. Leave it alone for now. The rest of the stuff in here is, well, I might as well talk a little bit. Guides, grids, and slices. Photoshop has the ability of allowing you to create guides on canvases or artboards, and smart guides and how they should appear. And you can create grids in, like grid line every 2 centimeters. Okay, I'm working with inches, so I'm going to say no, put a grid line at every 0.5 inch, which is half an inch. and how many subdivisions do you want in there? Do I want any or none? So I may just say one, sorry, just one, and that's it. And slices and paths options, it's again, slices is something that we don't deal with. It's primarily for web development work, and path is the pen tool's behavior and how thick that line should appear visually. You can make it thicker or thinner, and what color it should be, you can determine all of those things here. We will talk about this when we are actually working and exploring the pen tool. Plugins. Generally leave it alone for the time being, okay? And type we're not interested in for now. 3D we definitely not interested in. Any enhanced controls, perhaps with the newer technologies available, if you have a touch bar capability on your system, might as well exploit it, because you can check it and then it'll allow you to use the touch bar on your keyboard. Okay, I don't, so I am going to keep it unchecked. Technology previews. This is about new features that are perhaps being added on or experimented with, so you can actually check them out and what the behavior is and how they function. So you can check, because I was looking at what this feature is and how it works in terms of upscaling an image, and then you click on learn more and it'll take you to the website and show you what this is all about. Now, once you have gone through the interface of your preferences and you've set it, you will obviously hit OK. Now, if you don't like something, let's say I've hit OK, no changes have taken place as yet. For changes to actually then be applied to Photoshop, you have to quit the application and then re-invoke the application, and then the changes will appear. So now that I had made the changes in my preferences according as I wanted it to be, I quit Photoshop and I restarted Photoshop to see what the behavior may be and how things may have been. So my assumption is that everything that I have set in my preferences has been applied. Now, just in case, for some reason, you are not happy with whatever you might have done, so you can go back to your preferences, and there's quick shortcuts. On the Mac, you can do Command K. On the Windows, you will do Control K, and you will arrive at the same space, which is the preferences. And you can simply go back and click on Reset All Warning Dialogues, or Reset Preferences on Quit, or both of them, and you will then come back to its original state. Hopefully this made some sense. If you have any questions, I would be happy to answer. You're welcome to email me or whatever that works for you. Have a great day. Bye.